thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And I want to say a special thanks to John and Nicole. Trevor and Olivia are back there.
We're going to turn the AC unit off for you.
Yeah, exactly. That's all right. I'm so grateful for their hospitality. They are just a wonderful family, and for them to open up their backyard for us is just terrific. So we really, I've got a mic. So thank you to the entire family for opening up, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here, because I was telling John and Nicole that a lot of times when you're in Washington, you're busy, you've got a lot of stuff to do, and you're in a bubble when you're president, and sometimes you just don't have the opportunity to have the kinds of interactions that I used to have even when I was a senator. And so these kinds of formats are terrific for me, and my hope is that despite all these people who are here with cameras and microphones and all that stuff, that people won't be shy, because the whole point of this is for me to hear directly from you and answer your questions, hear about your concerns, hear about your hopes, and hopefully that'll translate itself into some of the things that we're doing at the White House. I obviously want to make some introductions that I think all of you know that you've got some members of Congress who are working very hard here in Northern Virginia, and I want to acknowledge them. First of all, Congressman Jim Moran has been doing great work for a very long time. So, Congressman Jerry Connolly has been doing terrific work here locally and now on Capitol Hill. We've got Sharon Bulovov, who's the chairwoman of the Fairfax County Board of Commissioners. And we've also got a couple of small business owners, because one of the things I want to talk about is how we can grow the economy and get people back to work. And so who better to hear from than a couple of small business owners? Don't worry, I'm not going to call on you, but I'm just glad you're here. First of all, we've got Cheryl Hurt, who's the owner of As We Grow Learning Center. Hey, Cheryl, thanks for being here. And Larry Poltasev, did I say that right, Larry? Who is the CEO of Target Labs, Inc. And so we're glad that you guys could join us. Now, I'm only going to say a few things at the top. And I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to run for president in the first place back in 2007, 2008. Having served as a state senator, having then served as a United States senator, I had a chance to see how economic policies were having an effect on working class families and middle class families for a long time. And my wife and I, we came out of hard-working families who didn't have a lot, but because the economy was growing, because there was an emphasis on what was good for the middle class, we were able to get a great education, we were able to get scholarships. Michelle's dad worked as a blue-collar worker, but just on that one salary, he was able to provide for his family and make sure that they always had enough and the kids had opportunities. And what it seemed like was for about a decade there, middle-class families were losing more and more ground. And some of that had to do with changes in the global economy and greater competition from around the world, but a lot of it had to do with the policies that had been put in place, which really boiled down to cutting taxes, especially for millionaires and billionaires, cutting regulations that made consumers and workers more vulnerable, failing to make investments that were so critical in growing our middle class over the long term. And so when I ran for president, my goal was to make sure that we get a set of economic policies in place that would lay the foundation for long-term growth in the 21st century, so that the 21st century would be an American century just like the 20th century had been. And that's what we've tried to do over the last 19 months in the midst of the worst financial crisis that we've seen since the Great Depression. The first thing we had to do was just stop the bleeding, stabilize the financial system, and make sure we didn't trip into a Great Depression, and we have done that. So when I was sworn in on that very cold day in January, some of you may remember, we we lost 750,000 jobs in that month alone. Now we've seen 8 consecutive months of private sector job growth because of the policies we put in place. We were on the verge of financial meltdown. Anybody who was involved in business at that time remembers banks were not lending at all. You couldn't even get an auto loan or a consumer loan. And now the financial systems have stabilized, although they're not completely where we need them to be. The economy was shrinking at a pace of, an astounding pace of about 6% annually. And now the economy has been growing. So we stopped the bleeding, stabilized the economy, but the fact of the matter is that the pace of improvement has not been where it needs to be. And the hole that we had dug ourselves in was enormous. I mean, we lost 4 million jobs in the last 6 months of 2008, when I was still running. We lost 4 million jobs. And all told, we've lost 8 million jobs. And so even though we've grown jobs this year, we haven't been able to yet make up for those 8 million jobs that have been lost. And that's an enormous challenge. Now, the second part of the challenge, though, is to make sure that even as we're digging ourselves out of this hole, we start making some better decisions so that long-term we don't find ourselves in this circumstance again, and we start creating the kind of economy that's working for middle-class families. So a couple of things that we did on that front. We cut taxes for middle-class families because we understand that people's incomes and wages have not gone up, have not kept pace with increases in health care, increases in college, and so forth. The second thing that we felt was very important was to start creating some rules of the road again. So in financial services, for example, we passed a financial regulatory bill that makes sure that we're not going to have taxpayer bailouts, make sure that banks have to operate a little bit more responsibly and take less risks with the money that they're investing. And we also made sure that consumers are treated more fairly, because part of what happened in this financial crisis was people were getting mortgages that they didn't understand. Suddenly the bottom fell out of the housing market and banks found themselves in a crisis situation. So what we've said is, let's make sure that consumers know exactly the kinds of mortgages they're getting. Let's make sure that they can't be steered into these balloon-type payments where there's no chance that over the long term they're going to be able to make their payments. Let's make sure that credit card companies have to notify you if they're going to increase your interest rates. And let's make sure that they can't increase your interest rates on your existing balances, only on future balances, so that they're not tricking you into suddenly paying exorbitant fees and putting you in a hole over the long term. So Jerry likes that one. So we set up a bunch of rules both in the financial services area, in the housing sector, and in healthcare. And I know that a lot of people here heard a lot about the healthcare bill. One of the most important things that was about was making sure that insurance companies treated you fairly. So if you've got health insurance, companies are not going to be able to drop you from coverage when you get sick, which is part of what had been happening. They couldn't deny you insurance because of a pre-existing condition, or if your child had a pre-existing condition, which obviously makes families enormously vulnerable. So a set of rules of the road for how companies interact with consumers, how they interact with workers. And then the final thing that we've tried to do to lay this foundation for long-term economic growth is to put our investments in those things that are really going to make us more competitive over the long term. So we have made the largest investment in research and development, in basic research and science, in our history, because that's going to determine whether we can compete with China and India and Germany over the long term. Are we inventing stuff here that we can then export overseas? We're making investments in our infrastructure, because we can't have a second-class infrastructure and expect to have a first-class economy. Just an interesting statistic, over the last decade, China spends about 9% of its gross domestic product on infrastructure. Europe spends about 5%. We've been spending 2%. And that's part of the reason why we no longer have the best airports, we no longer have the best rail systems, we don't have the best broadband service. South Korea has better broadband service and wireless service than we do. And over time, that adds up. It makes us less competitive. So what we've said is we've got to make investments in infrastructure. A third area, education. A generation ago, we had the highest proportion of college graduates of any country in the world. We now rank 11th or 12th in the proportion of college graduates. Well, we can't win in an information society, in a global, technologically wired economy, unless we're winning that battle to make sure our kids can compete. So what we've said is we're going to put more money into higher education and through K through 12, but here's the catch. The money is only going to go to those communities that are serious about reforming their education system so they work well. Because education is not just a matter of putting more money into it. You also have to make sure that we've got the best teachers, that we've got accountability, that the way we're designing our schools help our kids actually succeed over the long term, especially in areas of math and science where we're lagging even further behind than we were a generation ago. So those are the things that we've been trying to do over the last 19 months. Now, as I said before, the economy is growing, but it's not growing as fast as we would like. So over the last week, I've put forward a few more things that I think can really make a difference. Number one, instead of giving tax breaks to companies that are investing overseas, which our tax code does right now, what I've said is let's close those tax loopholes and let's provide tax breaks to companies that are investing in research and development here in the United States. That's a smart thing to do. We want to incentivize businesses who actually are making profits right now to say we should go ahead and take a chance and let's invest in that next new thing. Second is what I've proposed is that we allow companies to write off essentially their new investments early if they make those investments here in 2011. So essentially accelerating the depreciation that they can take on their taxes to encourage them to front load making investments now. The third thing that we've proposed, and this is actually pending right now in the Senate, the United States Senate, because Jerry and Jim have already voted on it, is a small business package that would eliminate capital gains taxes for small businesses, would help small businesses obtain loans. It is a common sense bill that traditionally would have garnered a lot of bipartisan support, but we're in the political silly season right now, so it's been blocked up by the Senate Republicans for the last month and a half, 2 months. Small businesses are still having trouble getting loans, and what we want to do, even though we've already given them 8 different tax breaks, is we want to say we're going to give you just a little bit more incentive, because if we can get small businesses growing and investing and opening their doors and hiring new workers, that's probably going to be the area where we can make the most progress over the next year in terms of accelerating employment and reducing the unemployment rate. So these are all steps that we're taking right now to try to move the economy forward. Now, I have never been more confident about the future of our economy if we stay on track and we deal with some of these long-standing problems that we hadn't dealt with for decades. If we make investments and improve our education system, if we make investments in research and development, if we make investments in things like clean energy, so that we've got an energy policy that's not just tied to importing oil from the Middle East, but instead start figuring out how can we develop our homegrown industries. If we have a tax system